Jeremiah, it's super exciting to chat with you. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Thanks for having me on, Nina.
Jeremiah is the CEO of Prefect, and on the side, he's working on FastMCP, which is one of the biggest open source projects right now on the MCP side.
I'm Jeremiah. I did found Prefect 7 years ago, which is my day job, and I love it. We make tools for automating and orchestrating data pipelines. And a few months ago, I really wanted to start using MCP, and I found the low level protocol to be kind of difficult to use. A lot of boilerplate, a lot of you had to really like read the manual to do pretty much anything. And every bone in my developer tools building body wanted it to be different. So I wrote FastMCP in a weekend and open sourced it. And it's funny back then, and I guess it was November or December, uh, MCP didn't have nearly the attention it did now. It was a little buzzy, but not like today. But FastMCP got enough attention as an entryway, and I was approached by the team at Anthropic that was curating, overseeing the MCP protocol development, and they asked me if I would be interested in having it become part of the official SDK. Now, at the time, I had no time to actually work on this thing whatsoever. We just had a million and one things going on at Prefect, and I thought that was a super exciting opportunity, and so we contributed it to it, and I marked it as not maintained, and that was that. And then starting a few months ago, as MCP really took off, I started getting tons of issues and enhancement requests on my unmaintained repo. And that was sort of the first sign that there was a demand for a more directed entry point to MCP than what the official SDK and its sort of breadth was providing. And at first I just told everyone like, no, go open these elsewhere. But what I discovered is that the version of FastMCP in the official SDK was not being worked on. So there were no commits to it in 4 months. And that's fine. It was a pretty solid piece of software for what it was doing, but obviously it wasn't a core item of attention. And so I decided, well, maybe there is something to do here. And so based on all of the issues and the enhancements and all the requests, I tore it down, I rewrote it from scratch, and we released FastMCP 2 about 5 or 6 weeks ago now. And it's just absolutely taken off. I think it'll cross 10,000 stars in the next week or two, which is, for all the open source projects I've worked on, it is by far the fastest growing, which is just really cool and exciting.
Yep, that's super exciting. And by the way, I had literally the same experience. I opened the Anthropic official MCP GitHub repo, and it like didn't even start. Like it couldn't get the example repo to run. So I think a lot of folks had that experience trying to open it. And it makes sense, by the way, because like Anthropic is like their researchers are very focused on how do we create AGI, how do we do push the frontier on the research side, and so maybe they're a little bit less equipped to build developer tools that folks actually can build on. And so maybe you can walk me just through a little bit about FastMCP.
Sure. So I think like there's a very substantial debate. I'm sure we're going to get into it in a moment about, do we even need MCP? We already have APIs. We already have standardized APIs like the Open API format. Like, do we need another protocol? And I think the answer is yes, we do. We can talk about that. But regardless of whether we need it or not, the good news is that there are standards, there are norms for how developers want to interact with APIs and frameworks for building APIs. And really what FastMCP seeks to do is to introduce those norms for the MCP protocol, which was introduced as an extremely low level protocol. If you didn't know every configuration and how to connect all the pieces together, you simply could not easily put an MCP server into the world. And so if that's the only understanding you have of FastMCP, that it is a set of norms around building MCP servers that just feel familiar to developers, that's okay. And I consider that a win as a developer tool.
There is some like chatter in the community, and everyone's like, how is this different from just tools or function calling, which I think was probably the like maybe the first iteration of this, but didn't get as much mainstream adoption. And I think OpenAI didn't quite do a lot with that. Like I feel like they could have pushed and taken that a lot further. Like what does a MCP actually give folks over and above the old API world or this world of tools and function calling?
So I think we could happily live in a world where everyone just exposes an API and you just hope that the agent figures out how to call it. We could also live in a world where we just take raw HTTP requests and hope the agent figures out how to call it. And I think that the minimal version of MCP is it's basically just a declaration of how the producers of tools that AI should consume and the consumers of those tools should agree on what the spec will be. And so I don't think that the question is, do we already had APIs? Why do we need MCP? I think the argument is just MCP is an agreement. It's a handshake between tool producers and tool consumers so that we can just like build models that just know for a fact they'll be able to use something. And we don't have to worry that, oh, you built an async API and my API is synchronous, but I use verbs in my post endpoints and you prefer not to do, you have a different sort of REST convention that you like. Even within APIs, we lack standards because typically you're dealing with your own client as the only consumer of it. And now we're dealing with the entire world of AIs. And so I think it's good, if nothing else, just to have the standard. What I think is exciting about MCP are the parts of it that go beyond just exposing basically functions as API routes. So there's the example that I think is most interesting, but is so little used. And I think FastMCP is one of the only clients today that actually exposes it. Is a feature called LLM sampling. So when your LLM uses a tool on an MCP server, that MCP server can ask the LLM to produce a new LLM completion and then send it back to the server. And so what you end up with is it's not just a request response model. It's actually a request followed by potentially other information passing back and forth, followed by a response. And I think that the interesting thing about having the standards is all of a sudden it permits a way to broadcast a set of capabilities, which today is a handful of things, including this LLM sampling, but in the future I expect will be more, where now if that server needs to take advantage of an AI capability, maybe it's summarization. For example, we have a large document. It fits in context. I don't want it in my context because if it comes into my context, it's going to stick in my context, it's going to put messages out of my context. It's just too big, but I do need to summarize it. We can use this LLM sampling feature to send it over. It's now independent of the existing message history. I can request the summarization of the document from the same LLM that wants to see it. And now I can send back the summarization instead of the document itself. It's a stupid example. It's a simple example, but it's probably a practical example of why this functionality would be interesting more than just shoving the whole response back in the context and then asking or expecting the LLM to engage the MCP server again. So these are the opportunities that standardization affords us to go beyond just hitting an API and seeing the response that comes back. And I think that's really interesting, even if only a small fraction of servers use it. There's a whole bunch of kind of out there stuff on the R&D shelf that we're working on, which takes advantage of these capabilities to introduce like new ways of collaborating and new ways to make token usage far more efficient, which I think could be pretty cool if they see light maybe later this month, maybe next month.
Yep. Yeah, that's actually actually really interesting because I actually think it goes back to the original architecture of MCP, which is I think when the first time I saw it, I was like, why is it a, server client? That feels actually like very weird. The initial reason I think was like I mean, I have heard a lot of opinions about this. One is that it was to enable like the localhost feature in the beginning, and that's actually like one of the reasons why they architected it this way so people could do the localhost version of it. The other explanation that I've heard is it was like all to support the state, which is some of that like LLM sampling that you just mentioned is like dependent on the fact that you have that statefulness, which by the way, like now can be stateless as well. And so it does feel like long term, it could end up being more of like a thin client. Like, how do you feel about that? And like maybe the original architecture of the thing, did that make sense to you that it was kind of set up server client structure?
It took me a moment to realize how the local sort of setup was intended to work and that the server doesn't actually run and every client basically invokes the server process, a new process just for itself. And I think only today are we starting to see like a shift away from that with the release of, in FastMCP and in the official SDK, we released this streamable HTTP protocol just yesterday. I think it went into the TypeScript SDK about a week ago. So it's very new. There's been an SSE. There's been ways of doing this before, but it's like right now we are starting to see it become very accessible to folks. But yeah, this like running it locally was the original way of doing it. And in that paradigm, I was surprised that it was considered a server as opposed to just a little application almost. Like we're playing with semantics a little bit, but it doesn't operate like a server. It doesn't run, it's not a long process. It doesn't take multiple requests at the same time. It's like a single serving little process that like is spun up for the length of the time you're making a call to it. And then it disappears until, in this case, maybe Claude Desktop needs to invoke it again, spins it up again, interacts with it, and shuts it down. And it's basically just a little portable logic container from that point of view. So I think it's more interesting to think of them as servers in a corporate context where like I want to broadcast tooling to AIs. I want to run this server so that any AI can just come and ping it and not need access to local compute and a way to invoke my server. I think that's a much more interesting world to live in. But I also appreciate that when this thing is getting going, one of the best ways to solve sort of the cold start problem where no one's hosting these things because no one's using them is just to say you don't have to host them. You just run them on your machine. Any GitHub repo that is like properly configured can be run. Any Python script you can run, and all of a sudden you get these, superpowers for your LLM. So I from a strategic standpoint, I get it. I think it makes a lot of sense. I do expect that now that it's really becoming a thing, I think we're going to move away from that. I think it's also the source of a ton of the security concerns, right? So as recently as a couple of months ago, a lot of people I talked to didn't realize that these local things are actually local. They are being downloaded by NPX or UV or whatever your package manager of choice is, and they're being run on your machine. And like no one that I'm talking to would willfully have their company just like download random software and run it. That's like, you wouldn't do that. But with MCPs, that is happening. And I think it's one of the places that the hype got a little ahead of the practicality.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, okay. Well, there's so much in there. I actually want to spend some more time later on the security vulnerabilities. But I think like maybe to back up a step, like, if folks are building MCPs, like what does that actually look like? Like, you have a fast API to MCP converter that you guys have on as part F. FastMCP. You have open API specs that you can also translate pretty easily into MCP. But is it as easy as just like I can just lift all my API specs and put it into MCP, or is there a lot more thought that goes into like how to actually surface those tools to the LLMs in a way that's useful?
It can be that easy. I'll be honest with you, I didn't think it would be that easy. It feels like an API that was designed for like your own client. If you're a company and you produce an API and you design it for your own client more than anything else to consume it. Like you're not going to invest in a lot of things that would, like, do you put nice descriptions on everything? Do you explain how everything works? Like, hopefully you do. If you care about your developer experience, you do, but most companies do not. And that natural language description is what the MCP client, the LLM, really relies on. So I actually expected that this probably wouldn't work too well. I changed my mind when one of my colleagues, Adam, took a very early version of FastMCP, pointed it at Prefect's own API, which I hope we've done a good job of making like consumable because we're a developer tool company, but I wasn't sure in the moment. And just like this, instantly was able to start using Claude Dash natural language questions about his Prefect deployments. And it just worked. Like crazy to me that it just worked, but it really just worked. And that's when I was like, oh shoot, this actually is an extremely viable way for people to get started. Just take an existing API and mirror it. I think the problem is those existing APIs come with a ton of routes that are completely irrelevant to your LLMs because it's the entirety of the API. And so one of the things that we're really working on right now in FastMCP are sane ways of pruning an API so that you could include or exclude certain tools depending on certain criteria. And I'd really like to get to a point in the near future where you can do that dynamically. So depending on who is talking to you, you actually expose a different functionality set to them. It could be permission-based, could be use case-based, could be just sanity-based. I don't know what, but right now, basically the entire thing is just regurgitated out to the LLM, and that's probably the biggest determinant of success or failure, more than the API itself. But to your question, like, yeah, you push a button or you write one line of code, and you can turn any Fast API app or any Open API compatible endpoint into an MCP server, just like that.
Yep, got it. And so like maybe it's like the proliferation of all of the endpoints and like permissions and scoping might be one thing that don't translate. I've heard
Exactly.
like pagination, for example, actually like doesn't make a ton of sense. In MCP, I guess like are there other things where just like you can't just lift it and shift it or that you guys have run into or anything
So
that's kind of different?
pagination is one that we just had an issue opened up the other day. To be honest with you, I haven't looked too deeply in it, so I don't understand the nature of the nuance quite yet. My what I want to believe, or my North Star in this, is that at the end of the day, this is where I want to leverage the fact that this is, quote, just an API. So if I can re-expose the arguments, whether they're path parameters or query parameters, body parameters, whatever they are, if I can just re-expose them in the correct way, I want to believe that whatever this thing sends back is ultimately compatible. Like, it sort of has to be in a sense. Now, there are reasons it's complicated, it's confusing, it's the way it's set up, doesn't make sense to the LM, it doesn't make the right sequence of calls, whatever it is. I could imagine that, but like my North Star here is we are just taking a natural language engine and translating it into a very prescribed like JSON call. I feel like we should be able to do it. I feel like there shouldn't be strong impediments, but I understand that, some folks are running into rough edges depending on the API, and we need to look into that.
Yep, got it. Cool. I mean, what are actual use cases that people are using MCP servers for, or FastMCP for, to like, what are the coolest things you've seen built?
I hear about the weirdest ones, not necessarily the coolest ones. So I have a colleague who uses it. I think he actually submitted this as an example in the FastMCP repo. If he hasn't, then the second we hang up, we'll ask him to do it. He controls the lights in his house. They're Philips Hue lights. And so he has an MCP server, so he can ask Claude to, when he's in our office, he can ask Claude, like, turn on or off the lights in my house and like do all this other stuff with them. So home automation, I think, is a really big area that I see. And of course, everyone's got some unique spin on that. And that's required new MCP servers. So I think my colleague is either involved in or helping maintain the Philips Hue MCP server, just as an example, which is an unofficial server as far as I know. Those are the most interesting things to me. As you can imagine, of course, every major service, certainly every communication platform, there's not just one, but probably 100 different MCP servers that folks have written against them for sending Slack messages or Gmail or whatever the case may be. I actually think one of the biggest problems to solve right now, and I saw there was a proposal just yesterday on this topic, is to have like a registry of MCP servers where we can get some kind of social proof or, I don't know, authentication that it is verified in some way or is secure, so we can have some measure of trust in what code we're interacting with.
Yeah, I think 100%. I think that's one of the things you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I guess like for other people's reference, it's like the first of all, there's no verification of who actually. There's no like official Google MCP. It's just like what the Wild West of like 10,000 people creating their own like Gmail
Exactly.
MCPs, and the craziest thing about it is like after you've installed it, which is by the way also kind of like a clunky experience, like all of those functions could actually just change and you would like not even notice necessarily on the client side that now it is doing something totally different from the original thing that it said that you were going to do. So I think those are crazy vulnerabilities. But I think to your point, like Anthropic, I actually don't know if it will be Anthropic or in some sort of open source foundation that will maintain a registry, but I think there will be a registry of like, here's the official verified, Stripe MCP or whatever. And you'll have that verification and that stamp that, and I think where this is going is it's the Wild West right now, but it'll actually mostly be producer owned MCPs. So the folks it's going to be Philips Hue who they own their own MCP, and it'll be the producers of these MCPs that are going to own and verify the official ones.
I totally agree. Or at a minimum, we will use something like FastMCP to convert an existing API in a restricted format, which hypothetically, like we could publish that. Like Philips Hue as a division may not choose to make an MCP server for themselves, although if they're listening, it's probably the most common thing I hear. They may not choose to make an MCP server, but they do have an API, right? And so one could rely on an unofficial server, or one could take that API and have like just a blessed transformer for it. I don't know if I am endorsing that. I don't know if that's a good idea, but like there's a lot of different ways we could see this evolving. But there's definitely a need to know that you are acting against an official API and not just someone claiming to be an official API.
Yep. Yeah. Maybe we could talk like actually a little bit quickly about like authentication. I think one way is to just ride on the previous OAuth rails. How is authentication handled within MCP, and how are you seeing folks do it? It seems like it's definitely a problem space, and even as recently, as like a month ago, people were like, wow, like I'm literally just pasting my API token as a
Yeah.
plain text token. Like, how secure is this? And how are people thinking for those vulnerabilities?
I think today authentication is a partially solved problem. So the latest version of the MCP spec does include authentication, and support for OAuth providers dropped a week ago, 2 weeks ago, in the various SDKs, including in FastMCP. It's very new. OAuth is kind of a pain in the ass to set up. So this is not a phenomenal user-facing option. It's a very good like corporate level option where you can take the time to set this up. But it is probably the biggest enemy of the fast in FastMCP at this time, and it's something that we need to figure out. But it is true exactly what you said. We don't want to just pass like an API key in, and have it be sitting there available for inspection, especially when we're running untrusted code. Like, this is not the way we want to do this. And so there is a need to like agree on what this format is. But there's another problem to solve, which is it's one thing to authenticate with an MCP server. It's quite another thing for that MCP server to now federate itself to other authenticated services. And so there's a real need for how are we going to have long-term storage of credentials so that you are not only sending your one handshake with the server you're talking to, but somehow stuffing every possible key you might need in the future for yet more services. And so whether it's the LLM doing it, which I have mixed feelings about, or whether it's an administrator setting this up in like a blessed way, we definitely need a way to have some sort of gateway protocol. I think that's one of the biggest unsolved problems right now.
Yep. Yeah. I think people are talking about OAuth maybe in the next versions of OAuth actually has permissions that are scoped by whatever function. And it's kind of like what you mentioned earlier, which is like, does an API endpoint actually have a scope for types of roles or types of people who can get access to that specific function within the MCP and that specific tool?
Exactly. And so you can take advantage of those scopes to restrict access to specific functions. But if that function, for example, sends a Slack message on your behalf, we need a second level. We need to now log into another service. And that login process has to be handled and managed separately.
Yeah. And OAuth has like all of the like cookie timers where you need like a refresh on the token, like in whatever, 2 weeks, 48 hours. And that's also just going to be a nightmare.
And so these are some of the things that needs to be baked in, not just to the server. The client has to know what to do with these tokens. It needs to know how to send the refresh if it gets an expiration. And these are solved problems, right? We've been solving these problems forever. I think it's just a matter of making sure that they work in whatever the emergent like tapestry is of how LLMs are deployed in the world and how MCP servers are deployed in the world. And it's definitely a lot of building the plane while it's in the air. People are using these things to such an incredible degree that most of the things that we are hearing about that lead to new feature requests or bug reports are because people are running these things in prod and finding these issues live, which is exciting and scary in equal parts.
Yep, cool. Walk us through maybe some of the fun little Easter eggs in Fast MCP. I know you guys have composite MCPs. What are some of the other more experimental features you guys are working on?
Yeah, so FastMCP 1, which is also part of the official MCP SDK, was really just focused on those on mirroring out the core server building functionality. So in MCP, that's tools, that's resources, and that's prompts. And how quickly can you just write a Python function and have it be exposed to LLMs? And in FastMCP 2, we've really been thinking about the flip side of that, which is great. Let's suppose that these servers exist and they're all made up of tools and resources and prompts. How do we actually interact with them? So we focused a lot on building client objects, like really quick and easy, sane ways to connect and interact with these servers programmatically, including as a human. So the interesting thing about building MCP tooling is you suddenly realize that once these servers are in the world, LLMs are not the only way that they will ever be interacted with. We need to programmatically interact with them as well. So clients are really important with sane setups. And then, as you mentioned, the other thing I've been really focused on is, well, you have all these servers in the world. There's a coordination problem to be solved here, and there's a composition problem to be solved here. And so we want to start with letting people just build their MCP applications in the same way you would design any like web API, where you would write maybe a module that has related functionality, and that's one standalone file, and then you have a main application, and you stitch that submodule into the main one as like a mounted server. And so we introduced the concept of mounting, so that you can compose different MCP servers that you write to have related logic into one larger application. That's been a very popular feature just for developers. The other side of that is proxy servers. So given that you have an MCP server, MCP servers are usually broadcast with the transport attached to them. So this is what we mentioned earlier about running it locally versus hosting on the web. One of the weirder things about the way the protocol works is that the server actually sort of announces how it's going to be run, in a sense. I'm waving my hands, and anyone who knows what I'm actually talking about is rolling their eyes right now. But servers will declare if they're meant to be run locally or not. And so you have this issue where if Claude Desktop only wants to run local servers, but a company has published it on their website as a SSE server, you're out of luck unless you use a proxy server. And so we introduced a proxy concept where you generate this proxy server by supplying it with a client, which could hit either a remote server, a local server, an in-memory server, it doesn't matter. And all of a sudden it can re-expose it now over any transport. And so a proxy server is just a pass-through, basically. But things get really interesting when you start to combine composition and proxy servers. And so now you can hack up your own gateway server just by proxying 5 remote servers and composing those 5 proxies into one server that becomes your single entry point to this world. And it just, from a management standpoint, as we get more into this include-exclude permission-based paradigm that I referenced earlier, it's just going to be a really sane place to manage access to all these servers. So those are kind of where we're pushing into new territory. We're leaving the protocol as stated behind, and we're thinking much more about how are people going to interact with these servers? How are people going to use these servers? And I think things like composition and proxying are definitely top of the list.
Yeah, that's actually super interesting. So do you think, I don't know, do you end up with a MCP gateway the same way you had API gateways and like this new generation of AI gateways? Like, is there actually a centralized place where you manage, hey, here are all of the MCPs that I'm
I I think
downstream
so.
using?
I think there has to be, for a variety of reasons, right? There has to be one because sanity is a big reason, but also I think this is going to be the number one way that we solve the trust issue. It's not just going to be that there's a registry of servers. It's going to be that, like any other software administrator is going to say, like, these are the MCPs that I want my team to have access to. And those are not going to be now exposed to that team as individual things that they can download and interact with. That's going to be exposed as like a central gateway that they use their own credentials to authenticate against, and then can now use any of these stitched services. So I think this is a key part of building trust, is having this oversight. Now, we haven't talked at all about there's a whole observability side to this, which is begging to exist and is coming into focus. That observability is going to be really enhanced by a lot of what we're talking about and the ability to stitch these things together into a common place.
Yep, got it. And then I guess like in this world where you have that type of gateway or you have a verified marketplace, like what happens to something like Smithery and those types of marketplaces right now for discovering and installing MCPs?
I don't know.
Do they just get subsumed?
I genuinely don't know. I don't view MCPs as crowding out alternative ways of building integrations. I mean, I come from the data space, right, where you would think that the second there was one official way to integrate with software, that would be the be all end all of it. And instead, every single year, every single month, we have a new way of integrating software, because there's always something new to do. There's always something better. There's always a new way people want to interact with it. So I don't think the fact that we're going to have ways of blessing specific MCP servers is going to crowd out necessarily a marketplace for providing, say, even non-MCP AI tooling and authentication. Because I always think, I don't know, maybe I'm speaking from like the painful experience of building extremely horizontal tooling in my past, but there's always a place for a more vertical and dedicated operation. I think that in horizontal tooling, the widest tends to win. The problem is that widest isn't what people want. Widest is how you get people in the door, but then you need to really deliver value. And so I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to tailor this experience. But I wouldn't venture to guess. It's not my business.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to go back to just use cases of MCPs. So I think it's interesting because most of the initial clients on the MCP side are like desktop Claude, but then a lot of these are the AI first IDEs. So Cursor, Windsurf, and it's folks using developer tools. And I think that's actually really interesting because most of the use cases I've seen for initial MCP servers have actually come from developer tools companies, infrastructure companies, like Prefect. Is that how you're seeing the landscape too? That it will be mostly, developer use cases first, or just AI coders, and then long term maybe there's an opportunity in like commerce. I'm actually really excited about everything that Stripe announced last week at Stripe Sessions. I think you'll have the ability to basically have an agent go make a purchase on your behalf, and that will probably ride on the MCP rails. So I'm actually really excited about the consumer use case, but the initial first wave I feel like has actually been largely developer tools targeting, AI first IDEs.
I totally agree with that, and I definitely have seen it play out exactly as you described, and it kind of makes sense, right? We're still so early in what this thing is. It is, I mean, sure, you could have a consumer version of it today, and who would really care? They wouldn't interact with it. But if you have a technology that needs shaping and that isn't perfect, putting it in front of developers is the best possible way to figure out what's going to work or what isn't. And I think that the addition of MCP to IDEs was a huge part of why there was this massive inflection point a couple months ago, because it solves this problem, which, if you're building agent frameworks, which we at Prefect have spent some time doing, it's actually a lot easier to dismiss MCP because you're asking people to write functions and just attach them to the agent. And you are the author of this whole world, right? You have an agent in your code. You have a tool in your code. Just stick them together and make it work. Why do we need this new protocol? But when you suddenly put yourself in the shoes of using a client where it's not programmatic and you don't have access to it, I'm talking about the cursor agent, for example. Well, now MCPs are such a godsend because I don't have a way to add a tool to that agent without writing code. I don't have access to that code. But MCPs give me a standard way to ensure that I have this handshake. And again, we're back to this argument where even if MCP did nothing except define a subset of API conventions that LLMs and LLM toolmakers agreed on, it would still be useful because it would let Cursor as an IDE instantly tell me whether or not a particular API was or wasn't valid for its understanding of how to do tool calling and interact with it. And so that standard really matters. And I think that, if nothing else, just being able to add tools to an agent that I don't have source code control over felt magical, still feels magical, and lets you add capabilities to it where, I don't think Cursor today can natively upload screenshots. I think you can paste screenshots in, but I don't think you can send them anywhere. But I can add an MCP that does let it, suddenly have this capability. That's really cool. That lets me customize my IDE in ways that are kind of unlimited in a sense, or that took a lot of code in the past. It's really interesting how this just expands the imagination of what a workflow can be.
Yep. Yeah, I've been vibe coding a little bit on Cursor, and there's a browser tools MCP that's actually pretty useful, and it lets you get all the console logs and paste it directly into from Chrome. So if you're running or you're writing a web app, you get all of the console logs, and that's actually been really helpful. But I do think it's interesting because Cursor's already actually done a really good job pulling in documentation, so you can literally just at a URL of a website that has documentation for a company, and it'll actually pull it in. And I think it's community driven, by the way. So it's if one person shares it, then they're also indexing that. And then long term, they're kind of building out this amazing database of all of the documentation. But there are some circumstances where it's still not up to date for whatever reason, or the documentation is kind of bad. And so it's referring to prior version of the tools documentation. So I think there are a lot of, improvements that MCPs could offer there, where if you're a API SDK kind of company, you can provide your documentation through an MCP, which is kind of interesting. And then the other thing is maybe actually anything you would have put in a CLI actually just goes into the MCP now, which is kind of interesting. So I think the slowest thing right now with vibe coding is you're clicking around in portals, I'm going to the Superbase portal and clicking all the things, or I'm going to the Apple developer portal, I'm clicking all these things. And I actually think MCP could automate those steps that I was taking on the back end trying to click for your developer portal by just automating those things.
Yeah.
So and surfacing that functionality, which I thought was kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, I actually wonder, and you sort of just like put this in my head, but like I wonder if there wouldn't be so much pushback to MCP if the P stood for plugin instead of protocol, right? Because the question, do we need another protocol, is a very good and interesting question. Do we need plugins for agentic services? I think is an obvious yes, and that's a perfect example of it. I've written applications against Supabase, great product, and I am manually interacting with it and running the CLI commands and stuff. I'm sure Cursor could run the CLI commands. I have it run all kinds of CLI commands for me. But yeah, I actually don't know if there's a Supabase MCP. If there isn't, hey Supabase, we should we should collaborate on that. But
I surely have one.
yeah, I'm sure they do. They're so cutting edge and everything. But that's a perfect example where I wanted to run my migrations or sync a database or something like that, and I just wanted to do it. Of course.
Yep. Yeah. Maybe this is actually a good time to ask you about what you think about MCP versus A to A, which is Google's agent to agent protocol. How do you think about those? Like, do they coexist? Do they compete? What are maybe the differences in how they approach the world?
I think they both coexist and compete because I think anything that isn't the absolute way that we've all agreed is what the path forward is necessarily sort of competes for that opportunity. But I don't view them as directly competitive, and I think Google is focusing on a very different sort of problem space, even though they introduce a similar vocabulary and a lot of similar capabilities. So I haven't spent a ton of time with A to A, even though ironically it solves a problem that I know really well because it's a primary problem that we've worked on in a lot of Prefect's own agent frameworks, which is agent delegation. So I think the easiest way to maybe understand the two at opposite ends of the spectrum, even though I think they overlap more than this, is that MCP is focused on taking non-AI resources and exposing them to AIs, to agents. And A to A, right there in the name, agent to agent, is focused on taking agentic resources and exposing them to other agents. So it's one thing for me to have an API that has a bunch of get requests for information and a bunch of post requests that you can make to take side effects, which I believe idiomatically you would make an MCP server that has resources for the get requests and tools for the post requests to take those side effects. That's cool. That's a way for me to expose that in a standard way. But if the thing I'm exposing is itself an agent, which means it doesn't have a specifically prescribed set of tools, but rather is going to rely on a natural language conversation and an exchange of information and in my opinion, the single hardest problem to solve in any agentic communication, and somewhere I have a whole keynote on this, is how do you know when you're done? You have this like very interesting problem of did you achieve the work and how do you agree on that? Well, it's one thing for you as a human or as a developer to find a way to set up that contract with your one agent. It's quite another thing for you to have confidence that that agent is setting up similar contracts with other agents so they don't all spin off into infinity or stop before the work is done. And so I think that the A to A protocol is really focused on facilitating those AI to AI interactions. Yes, it does also have ways to expose capabilities, specific routes, stuff like that, which feels a little MCP-ish. But I think it's a much hairier problem in some senses, and I think that there's a need for us to find some standard there. I do wonder, in the MCP world, we have this luxury / crutch, which is that we are representing fundamentally non-agentic resources, which is to say compute resources that we've all been working with for decades. We know what it is to expose a file, an image, an API call. We know the characteristics of that. The agentic world is changing so much still. I mean, it's tempting if you're in the world, it's tempted to say like, oh, it's been around for a couple of years, it's gone through multiple generations, it feels like we know what we're doing. But even the canonical forms of calling tools, of sending messages, of whether a message is just a role and a bunch of strings, a string like bunch of text, or something more complex, and the format for that and agreeing on it. My biggest concern would be, is it premature to try to introduce a standard around that doesn't inhibit the future progress we haven't seen? And I think folks who are closer to the metal than I am, who have more experience than I have, would say like, no, I think we're pretty sure on the basic forms of this that we can start to coalesce a standard around it. But as someone who builds against all of these vendor APIs, they have changed pretty much quarter to quarter in not in breaking ways, but in ways that introduce new capabilities, new hints, new functionality. And standards run some risk of sort of amberizing us into a world that the standard imagined as opposed to what the technology is capable of. And so I think that's going to be the biggest balancing act that the IDE protocol faces, is how does it balance exposing a standard while continually keeping up with the latest things in that? And how do they balance if Anthropic introduces a new capability? Does that now demand a representation in the standard? Or does it take two vendors to do that? Or does whomever is first to introduce a new capability really get to set the tone for, like, there's a lot of questions to ask when you're trying to create standards in such a fast moving space. I don't think that's a reason not to have standard. I think that's actually why having the standard exercise is a really constructive one and a really good forcing function, but it's a very volatile space, and who knows how it evolves.
Yep. Yeah. I actually think it's so interesting because I actually think MCP is actually a very like model centric view of the world, aka it assumes like, and I guess it makes sense. It's like it was created by Anthropic. I think they assume that the models will just become so intelligent. All of the logic will happen in the model. All of the thinking will happen in the model. And then all you need to do is provide context. So data, or here are some of the legacy functions or whatever, API calls, etc., that we need to surface to the super intelligent model. A to A is more of like a compromise, maybe, which is like the models will be smart, but there will be workflows that certain agents understand and codify. And then I will maybe want to call another agent that codifies some sort of workflow. And so I think I mean, we talk a lot about there's a transition that's happening between the prior generation of SaaS was like systems of record, which you probably heard, like CRM, etc. Like here's a system of record. And then the new world is kind of like here's an agent that codifies a system of workflow. And so then I can call and specify this system of, workflow that I've specified. And I think that actually is a logical way of looking at it, because even if something is super intelligent, there are just preferences that I have with it, with how my company does XYZ. When my company gives people refunds, or like what is the SOP that we follow for XYZ, that's more like value set based or something. That's not quite like, even if I was the most intelligent thing in the world, I don't know exactly how you guys do XYZ or perform XYZ task. So if that codifies a workflow and I can call another agent that like can specify that specific workflow, like that could be kind of interesting. I think what I haven't figured out is like, is a landscape mostly, companies will build their own internal agents and then be calling those, or is it very, we'll have other vendors that build agents and I'm calling a lot of external agents. That's kind of one question in my mind. And then the structure of agents, I think to your point, is like people call so many things agents. Like some of it just like, oh, I have a system prompt and that's kind of it. Some of them are like more of like the DAG state machine, like lane graph version of the world, which is like I've codified this. I actually like what they do with that. It's like we took DAGs and then we made it possible for them to be cyclic. And then we just codify the state machine, basically that codifies where I am within a state, within a process. And then, there's various other forms of like browser use is probably the craziest one, where it's like I'm going to use a traditional interface, but then I'll like return when I know that I've completed XYZ task. Um, so there's just like a lot of different configurations of like what an AI agent even means, and it's kind of, to your point, it's like very squishy. It's like, what do I even call an agent? Um,
Yeah,
uh,
and to me, it all comes down. I mentioned this earlier. To me, it all comes down to how do I know when to start an agent, and how do I know when it's done, and how does it know when it's done. And I think that
yeah,
everything in the middle, that's where you can play and do all kinds of crazy stuff, and have your graph or don't have your graph, or use a computer, whatever it is. But like that, how do you know how to start and how do you know when it's done? I think is the problem to solve. I think ADA is primarily dealing with how do you know how to start it, right? How does one agent invoke another one, and implicitly deals with the termination condition. The termination condition for an agent is the thing that fascinates me. It's my personal like soapbox is like I think most frameworks do a really bad job of giving you control over how to know if an agent has achieved its task. Graph-based frameworks, for example, I think pre-prescribe a number of tasks, a number of paths an agent can take. Maybe that's good for 2024 era agents, but the promise of autonomous agents is they will find their own paths, they will make their own plans, and we're not facilitating that if we pre-prescribe them. Computer use ones feels to me like, again, we're sort of overly cramming and overfitting an agent into a human designed interface, which may just be the reality of how this needs to work. But I think there's an argument that all of these standards, MCP, A to A, what they're really just trying to do is they're just trying to let agentic loops, so to speak, interact with the other things in the world in just a prescribed way without prescribing the behavior itself.
Yep. Yeah. I know we're quickly running out of time. Maybe you can touch briefly on, Prefect. What are you guys doing and seeing on the agent side there? And we can maybe call it a day.
Sure. At Prefect, what we're seeing overwhelmingly is a need to integrate agents with traditional software. So overwhelmingly what our customers are doing, I think what we want to believe, or what I want to believe that people are doing, is they're just wholesale dropping AI into everything. I think that's exciting. I think that's a fun future to imagine. No CTO at any real enterprise would keep their job if they just yield a bunch of AI into everything, right? And so what we are really seeing folks do who are taking their time to solve this problem well is they're looking at very expensive parts of their software workflows or their pipelines, and where there's a good fit for AI, which almost always has some tenor of classification or interaction with the real world or digitization or some translation between real world quantities and programmatic quantities. And they are replacing those discrete steps with LLM driven functionality. And the nice thing about this is that it means that in a lot of cases, the AI implementation problem is actually a lot smaller than we would make it out to be, even in this conversation about like freewheeling autonomous agents that need to call a whole bunch of APIs. It's actually like, look, we got this handwritten note. We need to figure out if inventory went out, read it. What does it say? Match it against the inventory. They're fairly well-defined little problems that I think are dominating what we're seeing, at least in B2B deployments of AI today. And what the agents are being allowed to do is they're being allowed to figure out what resources they need to bring to bear to solve that relatively discrete problem. And so our focus has been, historically, we focused on automating programmatic software. And so our major focus at Prefect has been on how do we create a sane framework that allows for not just software that was orchestrated by a script that a human wrote, but also software that was orchestrated by the brain of an LLM as it pursues some observable task. And very rarely do we encounter someone who's only running agents. There's almost always a need to see that interop, to see, well, in an MCP case, it would be what function did it call, but it's much broader than that. It's like you have a large workflow that has 100 steps. 3 of them in the middle were handled by an AI. How do we still maintain what we call the decision lineage of the entire thing, which is sort of the analog of data lineage in your warehouse, into a much broader and more interesting software landscape?
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining. This was I mean, I feel like I could talk to you actually for like a couple more hours on this because I feel like we only brushed the surface. Any last thoughts about, that we didn't cover, future of MCP, future of agents, future of Prefect, future of FastMCP?
I think right now it's just really fun in all moments to be at a place where developers are having fun experimenting. That's cool to see, and getting to respond to this emerging community has been so much fun for me. And now it's getting to a point where I'm dragging colleagues in to assist with this because it's become that important to maintain. So I'm just excited to see that people are enjoying it and using it and kicking the tires. And if anybody wants to check out the documentation, it's at gofastmcp.com. And I just, happy developers make me happy. I don't think a corny thing to say, but it's what I do. My whole career is building developer tools. And so this is just a really, really cool little moment to be part of.
Great. And where do people find you?
You can find me at Lowin on pretty much your social media platform of choice, Twitter, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, whatever it is.
Okay,
and Prefect,
cool.
of course,
Thank
at
you.
prefect.io.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. And it was amazing to hear all of your thoughts. FastMCP, Prefect, amazing. Really, really cool. And I love that you've just been building on the side, just low key.
It's just being in the right place at the right time, I think. And now we just want to make sure that it's as successful as possible because it's exciting. So thanks so much for having me on. This was a really fun chat.
Cool. Thanks.